we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for today's conversation, Polls, Politics, and People, Fostering Psychological Safety in the Intergenerational Workforce. My name is Samantha Isabel Calero. My pronouns are she and ella, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Vice President of People and Culture for InclusionBoston. The mission of InclusionBoston is that we are dedicated to eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. To describe this election cycle as unprecedented feels at times insufficient, and yet it's a way of indicating the considerable volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity that characterizes so much of what we're experiencing at the societal level. And this election is just one example of the multiple concurrent crises that underpin the instability and its compounding stressors, a phenomenon that is known as polycrisis. This context of instability, including the upcoming election, affects individuals not just in their personal and community lives, but is something that can get brought into the workplace and affect interpersonal communication and relationships and workflows across teams. This is evident across diverse identities and experiences, including notably generation. At the same time, we at InclusionBoston see this moment as a powerful opportunity to build organizational resiliency by centering equity and inclusion. This includes necessarily addressing the psychological safety needs of workforces through unpacking the cultural differences in communication, professional expectations, and engagement norms across generations. So what is psychological safety? There are 4 levels to it. And at the foundation, it really is about inclusion, having folks feel like they belong. And there are progressive or developmental stages of psychological safety, including learning, contributing, up to the ability to feel safe to challenge the status quo, have a dissenting idea or opinion, and feeling safe and able to do so without the fear of retaliation. And so who are we talking about when we look across the different generations in the workforce? Our workforce right now is as expansive and diverse as it's ever been, spanning from traditionalists who are folks age 78 plus to Gen Z, and actually beginning to have the oldest Gen Alphas. 2024 additionally is the first year that we expect to see Gen Z outnumber baby boomers in the workforce. And as a final level set, when we talk about an equity and inclusion lens, we want to talk about diversity in terms of the representation of different identities, equity as in fair access to resources and opportunities, and inclusion meaning the full participation where all voices are heard, respected, and honored. I'm going to pull my slides down. And so our conversation today seeks to move past news headlines and take a clear-eyed look at the current landscape and share actionable strategies to move through the election cycle and other external potential conflict moments with purpose, fairness, and resiliency. Thank you all for joining this conversation today and for the questions already submitted. I'm thrilled to introduce our dynamic panel of experts. Bukky Olugbemi is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Specialist at the Federal Home Loan Bank, where she strives to ensure all voices and perspectives are heard and valued. As a woman of color of immigrant descent, she learned early the power of cultural capital and the value it brings when allowed to show up in spaces otherwise inaccessible. From her work in higher ed to her current finance career, she experienced firsthand the impact and success possible when diverse voices are welcomed to contribute. The outcomes are unmatched. Bukky has tapped into privileges within her marginalized identities and created spaces for others, leaving institutions and entities better than she met them. Nguyen serves as the Director of InclusionBoston at InclusionBoston, where he leads the team in designing and delivering a range of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs to our client organizations. As an expert DEI facilitator and consultant, Eric possesses extensive experience with creating and sustaining inclusive cultures, change management, coalition building and stakeholder engagement, data-informed decision-making, cross-functional collaboration, policy review, and strategic planning processes. Before joining YW Boston, Eric was the director of the Center for Inclusive Excellence at Framingham State University, where he led efforts to advance institutional DEI priorities and strategic initiatives. Ciara Gogan is a seasoned leader in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, currently driving initiatives at CarGurus, the most visited automotive shopping site in the United States. With certifications from eCornell and Harvard Business School in diversity and inclusion and racial equity, respectively, she draws on over 2 decades of experience as a woman in technology and a proud member of the LGBTQIA+ community to empower organizations in cultivating inclusive workplaces. Ciara's impact expands beyond current role. She has been recognized as the 2024 Mosaic Honoree for Mass TLC's Tech Top 50 Awards and leads DEI Day for Leadership South Shore annually. Olivier Aries is an executive coach and leadership transformation consultant, an expert in the relationship between human behavior and business transformation. He empowers leaders, executive teams, and boards to transcend self-imposed limitations within people and organizations. He is the co-founder of the Thrive Collective, a firm that acts as a growth catalyst to help leaders achieve more with their people. Most recently, he was the VP of Professional Services at Predictive Index, a behavioral analytics firm. Olivier is the co-author of Line of Sight, 5 Keys for Strategic Execution in an Age of Uncertainty. We'll spend the next 30 minutes hearing from our panel on prepared questions and then shift around 9:40 to audience Q&A. As noted in the chat, you're welcome and encouraged to share questions using the Q&A feature and upvote any questions you're interested in having the panel answer. Again, this webinar is being recorded. Bukky, Eric, Ciara, and Olivier, thank you so much for joining our conversation today. So for our first question, I'd love to start with Bukky. When you think about the psychological safety in the context of intergenerational workforces, what comes up for you?
Yeah, thanks, Samantha. I think when I think about psychological safety in the context of the workforce, I think about being able to, as a millennial, being able to show up fully as myself. And what does that mean? So being able to show up to work as my authentic self within, who I am as a African American, Black presenting woman identified person, right? Being able to feel that my voice is heard and my contributions matter, irrespective of my age, right? In the space that I work, generally I'm the youngest person on staff, right? So feeling and knowing that my contributions are valued and aren't, the concept or feeling of ageism, for example, isn't showing up, right? And being able to not so much judge, but understood through the lens of the work that I'm able to present and achieve, right? And also, I think even thinking about on my personal side, how do I show up and create boundaries for work for myself as well as in my personal life, and making sure that that work-life balance really does prove true for me. I like to call it work-life harmony because I don't know if a balance really works. But I think in harmonizing, there's a give and take and a pull of sorts.
Thank you very much, Bukky. Eric, I'll pass the same question to you, please.
Great. Thank you. And thanks, Bukky. That was a really great intro to a lot of what I've been thinking about as well in terms of what does it mean for me to feel as though I belong at an organization? How do I contribute? And as somebody who straddles the Gen X millennial line, but can sometimes be perceived as younger, like I've also, tried to navigate, right, a workplace that does not necessarily see a lot of Asian Americans in leadership roles, but then also thinking about how age intersects with that as well. I think for me, one thing I think a lot about is that generations, right, are a social construct in the same way that a lot of our other social identities are. And so there's a certain degree of arbitrariness about like where we draw lines. We've seen, the definition of whiteness change over time, where we draw lines between socioeconomic classes. But because of that, we have this natural tendency to group people, to categorize. And then I think sometimes to attach oversized meaning to those groups, and then we magnify those meanings and differences. I think we sometimes ignore that there's a lot of similarity across groups, but then there's also incredible diversity within groups, which is to say that like it's important to recognize trends, but then it's also, we don't want to overgeneralize and stereotype to the point that like we can't see individuals. And to me, like that's a huge part of psychological safety, right? I think the other thing I think a lot about is that each generation does have their own defining moments. And when I think particularly about Gen Z, right, they grew up in this post 9/11 world where, you know, like nationalism, I think has really heightened both within the United States and across the globe. I think a lot about the ways like Islamophobia that arose out of post 9/11 has impacted, you know, and shaped the way in which we view a lot of conflicts, including, you know, what's happening in the Middle East right now, but also things like the recession of 2008. We saw the election of our first and only Black president, followed right by, you know, the 2016 election, right as Gen Z was like coming of voting age. And then we had the pandemic, right as Gen Z was graduating from college and entering the workforce for the first time. So I think that there's a form of anchoring bias here, meaning that like where we start, like what our reference point is, shapes how we view everything else, right? And so our older generations just have a much longer timeline to see progress and change, even if it's been slow, even if it's been really hard fought. I think this youngest generation is the first time I think we're seeing a lot of things being rolled back, right? We saw the overturning of Roe v. Wade. We saw the elimination of race-based admissions practices, you know, decided by the Supreme Court last year. So I think those are some things where, you know, even though we've seen some progress, like, again, we're seeing a lot of rolling back, right? So again, anti-LGBTQ legislation, so I think those are some things I think a lot about. Is like as we're trying to navigate conversations around the election and so on, we have to understand that people are coming to this conversation with really different lived experiences, and that's an important reference point that we sometimes forget.
Thank you very much, Eric. And I'd like to pass it now to Olivier and then Ciara. Given the context that Bukky and Eric laid out, how does the upcoming election impact or inform these considerations, this context?
Yeah, you want to go first? I will. Okay. Well, I think we have to we can think of this in two levels, like internal and external. Internally, I think we know that the what you call the police crisis, Sam. So that's the election, but also a number of other sort of stressful, anxiety-generating challenges that we face as society, as individuals. We know that this anxiety in the workplace tends to change people's behavior. We know that under stress, people tend to turn inwardly. We know that communication suffers. We know that collaboration breaks down. So first, I think it's important to publicly within organization acknowledge that pressure and that tension and give people some space to have those conversations so that that can become part of the sort of social discussion in the organization. But also, I think it's important to try to move on from the current anxiety. And I know it's easier said than done, but I found this quote from the German poet Goethe, who used to say, doubt can only be removed by action. And I think that internally, one way to help people, at least temporarily, suspend the anxiety that can be paralyzing is to kind of focus on what are we doing as an organization? What sort of action can we take? Can to be successful, to continue to operate as a group. And I think being able to move towards a more hands-on action focus is one way to maybe distract people from the current anxiety. So that's, I think, the internal side. The external side, and maybe that's a bit of a controversial perspective, but I think it's important to resist the urge to take, as organizations, political positions externally. I know that some organizations, by the very nature of their mission, have to or can have a voice in the political discourse. But I would say, working mostly with businesses in my practice, there's a lot of risk in taking a public stance on behalf of an organization. First, as a leader, you have a fiduciary duty towards your stakeholders, towards your employees, to preserve the organization's success and growth. And it's hard to do this if you turn off, half of your potential stakeholders. But also, and maybe that's where it's a little bit controversial, I know we tend to think of younger generations in particular as being mostly progressive, and that's mostly true, but I think there's also an emerging conservative youth movement, and we have to be just mindful of it. And especially if it's a minority, we have to think about how we preserve the psychological safety that comes from everybody feeling that there's the possibility for them to exist as individuals with their values and beliefs. And therefore, I think one way of doing this is to tone down a little bit how you communicate externally as an organization when it relates to political questions.
Thank you, Olivier. Ciara, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Samantha. So I think generations approach the current election differently, and probably all elections, right? But I think that younger generations, I believe that they don't necessarily see themselves reflected in the candidates at the top of the ballot for both major parties. And they've grown up in a time where the rights that are being threatened or have already been rescinded have always existed. And Eric alluded to that. There's been a rolling back of rights, and there's concerted effort to roll back more. And I think that all of those things maybe cause some of us to believe that sort of Gen Z, maybe even millennials, are apathetic to the current election, but I actually don't believe that that's true. I've seen a lot of very passionate Gen Z advocates working hard to ensure that their peers know what's at stake. And I believe that that message is being heard. I also think, like, within the workplace, the norms that maybe I'm Gen X, so the norms that we have, maybe Gen X and older generations hold around not talking about politics and other issues in the workplace are not necessarily held by younger generations. So Olivier talked about creating space to have these discussions within the workplace. Like 60% of millennials and 58% rather of Gen Z say they sometimes or frequently talk about politics at work, compared to only 41% of Gen X and 40% of baby boomers. And also millennials and Gen Z grew up in the age of social media, so they're much more comfortable publicly expressing opinions and are also more comfortable with not agreeing. Having a discussion with somebody who you don't necessarily agree with. Again, Olivier alluded to this sort of, a conservative movement in Gen Z. And so I think they're more comfortable having those conversations. And I also think, like Bukky said, it's really important to be able to show up fully as yourself. And part of that is being able to express yourself. So I think one of the things that organizations can do is find ways to, if not, actively encourage these conversations, at least, provide space for them to happen or not discourage them. Eric mentioned that Gen Z has had a lot of difficult defining moments, and this impacts how they show up and what they expect from us, maybe as their leaders and also from their organizations. InclusionBoston last 2020 published a really interesting blog on the topic of how to foster a more inclusive workplace during election season. It's definitely worth a revisit. They recently reshared it on LinkedIn, and I think Aaron's going to share the link in the chat. I think it helps contextualize psychological safety in the workplace during a turbulent election season, which we are definitely in. But I think that part of that fostering psychological safety is, sort of allowing for these conversations to happen, allowing people to sort of fully show up as themselves, and able to express themselves. And again, like I said, some of those stats, like the younger generations are definitely more comfortable with having these conversations at work and outside of work.
Thank you very much, Ciara. Eric, next, I'd love to go to you. What are some solutions or concrete tools and approaches that you'd advise organizations to adopt to improve psychological safety, particularly in workforces with diverse or divergent needs and in high stress scenarios like the one we're currently in?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there are lots of different ways to approach this. I think every organization is different, so it's hard to say do this thing, right? And it'll magically to fix things. I lean a lot into restorative justice approaches, or transformative justice approaches, which I think on its face often feels like it's reactive, like something has happened and now I need to respond to it. And I think in this moment, we're seeing a lot of that as well. But, you know, the premise of restorative justice actually lies in proactively, you know, building relationships, creating opportunities for connection, for people to get to know each other. And again, you know, I mentioned earlier, both the similarities across generations, the diversity within generations, like how do we begin to tease some of that out? And so I think I'll take a step back for a second and just think about some of the frameworks or ways in which I approach some of this work. So one is, you know, thinking about what we know through, you know, positive psychology, what we know about adult learning theory in our workforces. And I know that there oftentimes, right, is this human and natural tendency towards deficit-minded thinking. So feeling as though, you know, we're looking to place blame, we're looking at things that are shortcomings. There's a scarcity mindset, feeling like there's not enough. And so how do we begin to shift that, right? How do we begin to change our culture to have us be more strengths-based? How do we become, you know, how do we foster that abundance mindset in our work? So I think that's one framework that I often try to approach this work with. Another is thinking about systems change. I think a lot of times our efforts are directed at individuals. How are we changing mindsets? How are we changing people? As opposed to recognizing that we can implement systems, structures, policies that can shape the behavior that we want to see. And then lastly, I spent a lot of time working with organizations trying to help them understand power, just what it is, who has it, who doesn't have it, and how does that power shape the culture, and what are the ways in which we can leverage that? And so I think one question that I've asked a lot, and this is coming from my background in higher ed and academia too, is just whose knowledge counts. And oftentimes we can see really clearly in any type of organization, right, that power in the form of knowledge resides within a very select group of people. And so I think bringing that into this conversation more concretely, you know, one thing I'm seeing is that, you know, folks in our older generations, you know, there's status threat, right? Fear of being replaced, not knowing sort of what their role is in this really rapidly changing workplace. How do I have conversations? Because I get it. And I think even for me, recognizing the ways in which our younger generations are so much more adept and facile at talking about social justice, talking about diversity, equity, inclusion issues, like how do we keep up? But our newer generations, right, being digital natives, have such easy access to information and knowledge and social networks at unprecedented levels. They're fully leveraging these resources. And I think there's also this impatience to say, look, I can access knowledge, but I think, you know, trying to help our younger generation slow down a little bit. It's like, you know, there is experience to be gained, right? That does take time to build. And I don't think that our workplace is fully transformed and caught up to that rapid developments. And I'll sort of throw this over to Olivier in a second, but, you know, I think AI is rapidly changing our workforce. And I mentioned Olivier because he's been doing a lot of work, right, with organizations surrounding the advent of AI. And so I think, you know, one solution for me is just think about how do we build much stronger mentoring systems within our organizations. Right. So we're thinking about, you know, changing from scarcity mindset to abundance mindset. It's like, how are we leveraging people's strengths? How are we creating new opportunities? And so are there ways in which we're leveraging the expertise, right, of our older, more tenured employees? I think we're also thinking about ways in which they're, you know, looking to be generative, right, contributing to organizations and society. And then how are we creating those mentoring opportunities to benefit the growth of our younger and developing workforce? To marry, you know, their access to knowledge with their lack of experience navigating politics, right, navigating relationships and conflicts and so on. I think we'll begin to see, right, the benefits of that, both in terms of helping folks feel as though they can contribute in ways that allow them to leverage their own strengths, but also I think accelerating innovation as we think about experience, creativity, new technologies. So that's one thing I'll put out there, but want to, you know, certainly hear from other folks as well.
Thanks, Eric. Olivier, do you have additional thoughts?
Well, I'm going to disappoint Eric because I'm not planning to talk about AI. Sorry, not this time, I guess. But I'd love to use an analogy, though. And you know, we'll get there. When I learned to ride motorcycles, I learned that curves are actually not places or locations; they're actions. My instructor used to say a curve is a power event. When you want to take a curve, you put some power. And I think psychological safety in many ways, it's an action. It's not a cultural trait. It's not an attribute of your company's culture. It's a set of action that have to be taken by leadership. Sam showed the pyramid of psychological safety when we started this call from the angle of the person receiving or feeling the safety. But you have to work hard in organization to create that safety. And for me, if we think in terms of practical actions that leaders can take, I'd say, in my mind, there's always three I mentioned. The first one is, for me, psychological safety is when you take action on somebody else's idea. It's not just about listening to people, it's acknowledging them by changing something. And Eric, you talked about system change, maybe doing some system change based on people's ideas and recommendations. You have to not ignore what they're telling you. And the best way to not do this is to show that you're actually paying attention and take action and changing something. That's the first one. The second one is, in my experience at least, a lot of the lack of psychological safety comes in the tactical conversations, and one of which that I think is very important is feedback, is giving feedback, receiving feedback, which in organization happens pretty much all the time. And people are terrible at feedback, either taking it or giving it. And I think there's a lot to be said. I know it sounds basic, but there's a lot to be said about teaching, especially managers, to be good at giving positive, constructive, substantive feedback and receiving it too. That creates this psychological safety in all of those moments of truth that make up your daily life as a worker. And finally, the third, I think, aspect of psychological safety, and unfortunately, I see more and more organization dealing with this, is not tolerating toxic behaviors. I don't know whether that's because of the ambient stress and anxiety, but I'm starting to see more organization having to deal with specific toxic individuals. And, it's hard to take action or to take decisive action for those people, but toxic behaviors kill psychological safety, because now everybody feels like they're going to be exposed as they start to say something about those people or more generally. So you can tolerate those, even if it requires taking actions that we want to avoid ultimately. But I think those three things, taking action on people, ideas to prove that you're hearing them, working on improving people's skills in talking to each other, solving conflict situations, providing feedback, and having no patience for toxicity, I think are ways you can hopefully build a little bit of that greater safety.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to shift gears, and Bukky, I'd like to pass it back to you, please. What is giving you hope about working across generations to advance psychological safety as an equity and inclusion strategy?
Yeah, I think that for me, I adopt a growth mindset generally in all avenues of my life. So I think with each, as Eric said, with each generation, there's a new evolution of thought of, growth. And I think that in being open to understand, regardless of the generation or who's in front of me, I'm able to continue to not just remain in my own perspective and this is how it works for me, this is how I see it, right? But being able to consider how other folks are being impacted interchangeably, right? So thinking about within the workspace and creating psychological safety, how can we be open to, my way is not always the right way, right? And that, the cliche of 2 heads are better than one, thinking about an organization, 200 heads are better than one, right? Thinking about a team project, you can't just be the end all be all of knowledge or consideration. So really being open to growth and understanding that everyone has something to contribute, right? And valuing that contribution. And as Olivier said, I think taking it beyond, they said their piece and we're moving on, but taking action towards what someone has said, right? So considering, okay, so that perspective is different from my own. How can I take that further to better understand and equip myself for betterment in the future, but also for whatever the task at hand might be or the goal that we're trying to reach is.
Thank you. Ciara, same question, please.
Absolutely. I just want to pull on a little thread that Olivier mentioned earlier, just quickly on feedback. So he talked about feedback being an action that we can take around developing or helping to produce or I don't know, create psychological safety. And I would just say I 100% agree. And one of the things that happens with feedback is people are often not comfortable giving sort of constructive feedback to people who aren't like them. So if somebody's from a different race, a different gender, a different generation, a different, sexual orientation, whatever it might be, people are afraid maybe to say the wrong thing or be canceled. And so they don't give constructive feedback or any feedback to people that are not that they're not comfortable with or they're not like them. And that's actually something that can hold people back. So that's one of the things I think people have to get past in order to best support all their employees. Having said all that, to answer the question that you have posed, I actually really love what Gen Z and millennials bring to the workplace. I think they're shaking up norms. I think they're forcing us to rethink ways of working, and we should. I think they're forcing us to rethink how important the values of an organization are to us and to them, and an organization's social standing. I love this disruption. I think it's just it's going to really continue to shake up workforces and sort of force us to relook at how we do things and why we do things. According to a Deloitte poll, Gen Z no longer forms opinions of a company based solely on the quality of their products and services, but also on their ethics, their practices, and their social impact. I think this is awesome, and I think it's going to move us forward in ways that we have yet to imagine.
Thank
Gen
you
Z
so much.
is actually,
No, please continue.
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, please continue.
No, yeah. So I was just going to say, to sort of pull this into that sort of psychological safety and equity and inclusion, Gen Z is the most diverse generation as well, which means they have an expectation, maybe even a demand, that DEIB is a priority, which benefits everybody. They're also the most gender fluid generation, and they expect companies to honor that. Like upwards of 88% of Gen Z's polled in a recent poll felt that companies must inquire about gender pronouns, for example. And I think one of the actions that we need to take, Olivier talked about actions in order to advance psychological safety as an equity and inclusion strategy, is to build trust. And in order to build trust, I think we have to understand the needs and wants of each generation and the individuals on our teams and find ways to honor that. And if we can't build trust, I don't think we can have psychological safety. So I think all of that stuff that Gen Z and millennials bring to the workplace strengthens psychological safety if we cultivate cultures where they can fully express themselves. And if they get to that sort of challenger level that you showed earlier, Samantha, on that top of the pyramid, where they can actually really challenge the status quo, I think we'll all be better for it. And I think that drives inclusion and equity. And if that's done right, it drives psychological safety. I think they sort of feed off each other. I think it's cyclical, and I think that these like younger generations will help us get there, honestly. So those are my thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. Olivier, what's giving you hope about working across generations to advance psychological safety with regard to equity and inclusion?
Hope. Well, I think there's hope. What Ciara said, I think, is very true. In fact, that might be the core. You said that especially Gen Z generation forces us to operate differently in organizations. Interestingly, I was with a client up in Maine yesterday, and I got a perfect example of this. They are extremely labor constrained. Like they have severe labor shortage of people with the skills that they need to manufacture boats and other things. And so they have to hire people who are fairly young and new and inexperienced and train them. And they gave me one example. They said one thing that we've now forced to change is that before, the supervisor would take the employee and say, well, today you're going to do this. And the employee goes doing it. And they said with the Gen Z, that just doesn't work. You have to explain why you're asking them to do something. You have to give them meaning for their actions. And even if the only change that happens, I think this is fundamental. Right? Because as human beings, what do we need to operate and to thrive? We need control. I'm in control, or I have some control. We need belonging. I'm part of some sort of tribe. And meaning, I know what I'm doing matters. And so if the only change that we see, and hopefully there's going to be more, is to force us to, beyond the Gen Z, just think about how we give meaning to people in the workplace. That is already a massive achievement. So that's my hope.
Thank you. Eric, what's giving you hope?
Ooh, folks have covered so much already. I think for me, I think a lot about just the incredible benefits and opportunities for us to learn when we bring diverse groups of people together. And I think, again, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, right, race, ethnicity oftentimes is the first thing that comes to mind. But we're talking about a moment in time where we have 5 different generations working together. That's just an incredible range, right, of experiences, knowledge, ways of seeing the world. And I think if we can't find a way to capture that, to leverage that, we're missing out on a huge opportunity. So the hope for me is that as we're having these conversations, as we're studying ways to foster that psychological safety, we can see some really magical, beautiful things happen, both in the workplace and outside of it. I also think a lot about, the work that Bell Hooks did, right? Think about working from the margins to the center. Similar type of concept here, but as we're thinking about fostering psychological safety with a lens on, intergenerational workforces, I think that is only going to benefit us in thinking about how we're creating and fostering psychological safety across race, right? Across gender and so on as well. So that, for me, that's the hope. We have this incredible opportunity right now.
Thank you very much, everyone. So now we're going to shift gears and turn to the questions that our audience has asked. And Bukky, I'd like to start with you first, please. One of our participants asked, how can leaders support psychological safety when not everyone is going to get exactly what they want? I've noticed that because feedback can be on opposite spectrums and not everything can be acted upon, it can be misrepresented as not caring.
Yeah, I think to answer that question, I think about the concept of equity, right? So equity and equality, folks tend to, sort of use interchangeably, but I think being able to thrive requires you getting what you need to achieve whatever you're doing, right? So if we're thinking about a lot of times folks, when they think about quality, they're thinking about let's say a pie or a pizza, right? And it's like an all or nothing, right? But if we think about it from the concept of equity, right? If we have a goal and at the end of the day, it needs to be met. What I require as a person to achieve that goal might be different from what Eric requires to be able to achieve that goal, right? And being able to then take that and, in giving feedback, for example, being able to highlight, okay, what is the actual need and how can this person actively thrive and achieve and complete this assignment? I think that would really help folks, even in the feedback sort of space, because at the end of the day, you can tell someone, okay, well, you did this, you did that, you could do this better. But if you're not getting to the core of maybe why they were unable to achieve certain things, you're missing the mark.
Thank you very much. Ciara, Eric, or Olivier, do you have additional thoughts on this?
I'll jump in really quickly. I'm sort of latching on to the words of like, not everything can be acted upon. And I think that's an important piece, is that, I talked a little about scarcity mindset earlier, trying to shift to abundance mindset. But, as we begin to shift the needle, we have to think about what our priorities are. What are the strategic priorities, right? What are, right, some of the real resource limitations that might exist in the moment as we begin to shift that. One thing that I find, especially with Gen Z, and Ciara mentioned this earlier, right? The piece about being digital natives, being on social media, I think it's this demand and comfort with greater transparency that we haven't seen in the past. One thing that we also haven't talked about, even though we're talking about age and generations, is just our relationship to time. I don't know if it's just me, but I feel as though we're just accelerating and trying to cram so much more in. And we just need to figure out how to slow down. And I say that because I think there's a lack of patience that's happening across the board in our organizations. And I'll give a very quick example, right? We're seeing demand for change from, some of our more progressive or younger, employees. We have leadership teams saying, well, not right now, or we can't. There are just certain things that you don't understand because you're not at the leadership level. I'm like, great. Can you explain that, right? Can you slow down? Can you stop? Can you help, right? Your employees, whether it's your middle managers, so they can communicate, right, both up and down the ladder. Help your younger employees. That's a way in which I think, again, we can leverage some of that mentoring, some of the expertise, but I find that oftentimes there is, again, sort of this consolidation of power, this consolidation of knowledge, but also I think time is a factor in there as well, where we're just not willing to slow down and have some of those really important conversations. I think, yes, we can't act on this right now, and here are the reasons why. Let me help you understand. I think that goes such a long ways towards helping people feel heard. And so Olivier said earlier, yes, make the changes that you can. But I think even understanding why you can't can also be a really great move in the right direction.
Thank you so much, Eric. And I just want to acknowledge, I think we could spend at least another hour diving into that topic or any of the others, but there's some fantastic questions from the audience, so I want to move us along. And your response was a really nice segue into this. I'd love to pass it to Ciara next. This workforce is transgenerational. How do you aid boomers when they feel like they have to walk on eggshells, so to speak, when conversing with those younger than them?
I think my answer to this is that, we've sort of talked about younger generations being much more open to disagreement and having tough conversations. So I don't think that there's a need to walk on eggshells. I think that there's a fear maybe of sort of being canceled or being, sort of dismissed or whatever. But I think if you can build relationships with people and have a genuine conversation and sort of be vulnerable yourself, with that person, I think you can have open conversations and you don't need to walk on eggshells. I think that the eggshells is in my view anyway, is a mindset of maybe my generation and the older generations. It's not necessarily a mindset of the younger generation. So it's something that you can make your own mental shift away from and have an uncomfortable conversation, which is not something that we're all comfortable doing. But I think just being a little bit brave and just sort of diving in, I think you'll be well received. I think if you're open to learning and hearing something contrary to what you might believe, then I think that goes a really long way.
Thank you. Other thoughts, panelists? Disrupting the eggshell walking or leaning into generative conflict.
I think that, a lot of times when we have DEI conversations, we talk about, this is a safe space, right? And I sort of disagree with that terminology. And I've adopted more of an idea of a brave space, right? So entering into a space, recognizing that you will be challenged. And even when we think about, the dichotomy of our own families, right? So in the same family, siblings are different. Right? You can't then expect that when you're in a workspace, folks won't have differing opinions or understandings than you are. But I think being able to enter in it bravely, understanding that, okay, this is either a moment of acknowledgement or growth, right? So if I'm gonna enter the space and, be disagreed with, I could learn from this, or I could just take this as, great, we're different and it's cool and we're moving forward. Because not all spaces are safe. And that's okay if you can be brave in the moment.
Thank you. I want to pass this next question to Olivier because you touched on this in an earlier response. And our next two most upvoted questions are, I think, closely related. So I'm going to read them both to give a bit of context. The first is, how does an organization distinguish between political positions from ethical or moral positions? And secondary to that, when discussing politics or making a statement internally, How does an organization do this without excluding some employees? Our goal is to be an inclusive environment, and there can be a lot of division on certain topics. So how does an organization be successful in discussing these topics without ostracizing some folks?
Wow, these are really good, tough questions. I don't know whether I'm going to answer them in a way that's really satisfactory. I would say that when it comes to the first one, so political versus ethical positions, I really hate to say this, but there's a lot of judgment involved in this. And I think that when you're in an organization, so here is where I would draw the line. I always encourage the companies I work with to be very clear about the attributes of their culture, and not in terms of like general terms, but really in terms of action. I suppose that, I like action, so I often think in terms of actions, but really that helps, right? Because when you have values in organizations, the only thing that really matters is how well that help people make decisions. So you have to be really crystal clear. So, for example, I remember I worked in an organization where one of the values was risk, right? So what does it mean if I just tell you, oh, we like to take risk? So one way of making it actionable was to say, we'd rather have errors of actions than errors of inaction. So now that gives you a sense for how you approach particular decisions. And I'm mentioning this because for me, the line between political and ethical can be drawn where you develop the values of your organizations. For me, operating ethically should be something that is explicit in an organization that says, this is how we operate here, and this is how we continue to be good citizens, good human beings, and a good organization serving our community. And I would say everything that doesn't tie directly to those values, for me, becomes political, and that's something I would suggest you stay away from, because that's an area where it's harder to have a clear set of guidelines for decisions. So I'm sure this is not a very satisfactory or clear answer, but I would and I'm maybe not ambitious enough in the way I think about this, but protecting organization and employees, I think, really matters these days. And I just want to make sure that we stay within an area where people feel like their positions are not overly controversial. And the other one, how we make sure that we don't, I guess, inadvertently exclude stakeholders, employees from the conversation. For this one, I'd love to go back to what Bukky said about safe space versus brave space. Now you make me think that I don't like safe spaces, and now I know why. But that's because when you start to talk about brave space, you give people permission to lean into the difficult conversations. And it's hard. But there's a couple of tricks, actually, that I think you can use to lean and allow everyone to feel entitled to be part of the conversation. And one of the tricks that I think is the most powerful I ever heard about comes from the concept of positive intelligence, and that's the 10% rule. And the 10% rule says that in any conversation, argument, debate, you have to acknowledge that at least 10% of the position of the other person is valid. And it's on you to find what those 10% are. And the positive intelligence trick is to say, when you're in the debate and the conversation, to force yourself to acknowledge the 10% is to start a proposition by saying, what I like with your position is. And that forces yourself to create that space of acknowledgement of the other person. Maybe they might be right for a little bit of it. And that, I think, if everybody in the organization acknowledges the use of those tools, now you make it, I hope, both braver and safer to lean into the conversation, because everybody deals with conflict in the same way with the same tools. The rules of the game are very clear. And it's a game that hopefully creates the space for greater understanding, finding common, points in common, which is the foundation of trust, right? You trust people who you feel you have something in common with. So again, I don't know whether that's a very satisfactory answer, but those little tips and tricks, I hope, create the space for people to feel like everybody has a voice.
Thank you very much. Eric, Ciara, Bukky, additional thoughts on this?
I think I'll just add really quickly, building on what Olivier said. To me, a lot of it does come back to values as well, both at the organizational level, being really clear about what your values are, but also what do they look like in practice and what do they not look like in practice? Because if we're just throwing words out onto a piece of paper, onto a screen, people are going to layer on their own interpretations and meanings. And I loved what Olivier said about, we value risk. Okay, great. Right. But what does that actually mean in practice? And just even that little phrase, right? Errors of action versus errors of action. I think adding that kind of clarity is really helpful. But there's also the personal values piece. And I think that oftentimes we focus so much on divergent behaviors as opposed to convergent values. And so how do we, again, there's a time piece in here. If we're thinking about brave spaces, we also have to give people the tools to have these conversations, to engage in disagreement. Someone in the chat shouted out their InclusionBoston experience, creating call-in cultures. And we talk about call-in cultures as cultures where, we can lean into disagreement, but we're preserving relationships. We're prioritizing learning and growth. That's not always easy to do. So it's one thing to say, it's another thing to live it in practice. But how do we take the time to dig beneath the surface and say, like, what is it that we actually share as values? Can we use that as a starting place, even if it leads us to different outcomes? I think, we're here to talk about the election, but just to illustrate that really quickly, if we're looking at some of our older generations, right, we know that what we've seen is sort of loyalty to an organization. They've stayed at organizations for, a good majority of their career. With our younger generations, there's a little bit more career hopping. So we might say, well, like really divergent behaviors, one group cares about the organization, the other group doesn't. But to me, if we dig beneath the surface, right, there are actually shared values of loyalty there. One group is loyal to the organization, right? The other group is loyal to their work. And so if we start with that shared understanding of like, what are those values that we hold really near and dear, can we begin to meet individual needs, right? Can I then accommodate or act on, right, your loyalty to work so that there's also a loyalty to the organization, right? Can I leverage your loyalty to the organization to also help you, right, care deeply about your work? I think those are things that we can begin to do in, in a lot of these different conversations where we see conflicts, divergent behaviors. Let's come back to what those shared values are.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. And this one is interesting. It's got a bit of a future focus, which I like. One of our audience members is asking, I'd love to hear the panel talk about how we can shift the concept of mentoring from a one-way learning from older to younger persons to a two-way learning across generations.
I mean, I can jump in on this one quickly. I think every mentor relationship has the potential to be a two-way relationship. And I think that the mentor, if a mentor is going into a mentorship relationship thinking like, I'm going to teach and not learn, then they're not like fully, like they're not going to get the best out of it. I think so. I think like it's just, again, it's sort of a mindset shift of just saying like, what can I learn? I think, Eric, you touched on, many times the sort of, digital generation, like people have like a lot of, skills and information at their fingertips. And I think we can learn from that too, right? I think that I've sort of embraced that in many ways, being sort of more digitally connected in ways that I haven't been before. And so, it going into a mentor-mentee relationship, just be open to learning. It's like the actual conversation doesn't have to change necessarily. I think it's just a mindset going into it that you can shift. At least that's I mean, maybe the conversation has to change some, but I think certainly the mindset shift of like, I'm there. It's a two-way engagement rather than a one-way sort of like, I'm going to tell something or teach something.
And at the end of the day, we're building relationships, right? So like a mentor-mentee setup, it's a relationship building opportunity. So at the end of the day, I might come to someone and ask them to mentor me with a specific objective, but they can also learn things external to that objective in the relationship, right? So as we grow together, as we're checking in, right, they might learn something about my personal background and then want to learn how to make a specific meal and want to, right? It doesn't have to be stuck in that construct of the original intent for the relationship. And the growth there is great beyond even the two of these folks who are engaging with one another, right? In that relationship, you could end up at a cookout and learn more with their family, right? So again, it's, for me, that construct is meant to build and expand relationally.
Thank you, Bukky, and thank you, Ciara, earlier. All right, it's about that time. We're coming to the end of our webinar. First and foremost, thank you to all our guests who joined us today. Thank you very, very much to our panelists, Ciara Gogan, Bukky Olugbemi, Nguyen, Olivier, Aries, as well as our absolutely fabulous staff working behind the scenes to produce this webinar. Thank you so much, InclusionBoston. During periods of societal uncertainty or change, being part of a larger community to learn from and support one another is particularly important. We invite you to join our community by following our Thriving Together series. Schedule a conversation with our partnerships team led by Ciara Bornstein to discuss how we can support your work and share what you learned today with others. Whether you're seeking data to drive your DEI strategy, support building trust and communication skills among staff, or developing action plans to drive change, InclusionBoston can support you along the way. Aaron will be dropping Ciara's information in the chat in case you're interested in follow-up, and we hope that you consider partnering with us and supporting our work. Thank you all so much. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Take good care.